بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الأخ الأمين العام السيد رئيس حركة النهضة الشيخ راشد غنوشي السادة والسيدات أصحاب السعادة ضيوفنا الكرام مرحبا بكم بتونس. في البداية التمس منكم بكل لطف أن تسمحوا لي بأن ألقي كلمتي باللغة الإنجليزية تقديرا لبعض الوفود التي أتت من كامل أنحاء العالم وشكرا. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. African statistics speak of great potential. We have seen in the short video earlier how big Africa is. But let me give you a graphic illustration that will show that even more. Do you know that the area of Africa is Mexico, the United States of America, Europe, India, and Japan combined? It's 1.2 billion people today, and as it has been indicated earlier, it will be more than 2 billion people by 2035. Africa is also a very rich continent. We have seen some statistics earlier about the huge natural resources that Africa has. If some of our founding members, founding fathers of Africa, if some of them were to rise from their graves, I'm talking about the likes of Mbeke, Houphouët-Boigny, Bourguiba, Mandela, and others. If they were to rise from their grave, they will be happy to see that Africa is pursuing a path towards prosperity and dignity. They will be happy to learn, for example, as it has been mentioned earlier, that the 10 countries in Africa that show by and large, the greatest growth rate are in Africa. They will be happy to find out that many African countries have succeeded in the structural adjustment program, that the indebtedness of African countries is now some of the lowest in the world, and that Africa is really moving ahead towards stability. More importantly, they will find out that a young African generation is taken over. They have gotten rid of the shackles of colonialism, and they are free to act, and they are acting, and they are, in fact, designing a new perspective for Africa. They will be happy to learn, therefore, that Africa is getting its act together. But at the same time, they will be sad to find out that many of the ailments that have plagued our continent are still very much there. For example, 1 out of 4 people in sub-Saharan Africa is still undernourished. The 10 poorest countries are in Africa. 50% of the poorest people are in Africa. And Africa is still plagued by famine. Look at what is happening today in South Sudan and in some parts, in other parts of Africa. That is not good news. They will also be saddened to realize that corruption is still very much there. They will also realize that Africa is not really pulling its resources and making use of its resources to ensure the trickle-down effect on its people. Africa is still exporting commodities and is not transforming commodities to create value added in their economy. And they will be sad to learn that there is still some ways to go. So we are optimistic, but let's not fool ourselves. The challenges ahead are still great. So I would like to address with you today what I consider to be 6 major questions that are facing Africa today. And I would like to talk about a subject which was raised earlier, which is investment and the importance of investment. And what applies to Africa, by the way, applies to our own country. We know that investment is the solution to the unemployment problem. Of course, there are other solutions, but investment is a major solution. And we also do know that just like in Tunisia, the fiscal space of the different African governments, their capacity to finance the economy is reduced. And therefore, government spendings or government investments would not be the answer. And henceforth, the only way to move forward and promote investment would be to promote private investments. And the question is, how are we going to do that? Promoting local investments, in other words, investments within a country, and investments within Africa. I would like to talk about both. It's a very complex subject, but suffice to say at this point that promoting investments requires certain conditions to be met. The right business environment, the right policy environment, a stable macroeconomic perspective, a strong financial system, which I will be talking about. And if those conditions are not met, and unfortunately they are still not met in many African countries, then promoting investments will continue to be challenging. And of course, then the alternative is to tap on international capital. In other words, to go find resources elsewhere. And that poses other problems. The problems that will pose are indebtedness, because obviously if we were to raise resources in the international capital markets or from development banks, that will put a heavy weight on the country's capacity to reimburse later on. And there are many other challenges, such as whether those foreign investments will be able to be hedged, so that we would encourage foreign investments to come in. And the same problems, quite frankly, apply to our own country. How about inter-country investments in Africa? There is some good news, and the good news is that within Africa, African investments, in other words, investing by Africans in Africa, has been increasing by about 10%. And the trade flows between African countries is about 10% today of the total flows of Africa. Sadly, the one region where inter-country flows or trade flows is the lowest is in the Maghreb, which is only 2%. So we have some ways to go there. And we have seen evidence in Africa that Africans are working together more and more. We have seen banks investing in Africa. Nigerian banks, such as the United Bank, moving into 19 countries in Africa. I had the privilege personally, and the minister was kind enough to have mentioned that when I was heading the second largest bank in Morocco, to have pioneered the positioning of Morocco in Africa. And I was able, within 7 years or 8 years, to gain a presence in about 22 countries in Africa, both in West Africa and East Africa. Other foreign banks, including Tijeri, followed course. And what happened then? If you have a banking presence in these countries, the business groups will follow. And that's exactly what happened. So Moroccan groups are now investing heavily in Africa. And so having a banking presence from different countries, in different countries, will speed up and will enhance investment flows between African countries. The same thing would apply to ICT. We've seen ICT companies from out of Kenya, for example, investing in Rwanda and in some other places. We have seen the South Africans investing more than $2 billion in Africa today, and they intend to invest even more. And so this is important because intra-African investments means that Africans are taking their own destiny in their own hands, and they are investing within Africa to create value for Africans. That's important. But there is one condition, and that's my second point, for that policy to be successful. And the condition is to have a strong financial system. Without a strong financial system, any investment effort will only be mildly successful. What do I mean by that? There is a German economist who said something very important. I want you to keep it in mind. He said, capital is made at home. His name is Albert Hahn. And he was talking about Germany after the Second World War, when Germany decided to curtail American aids, American financing of Germany. He said, no, we have to stop that, and we have to create our own financial means and our own financial resources. And you know what happened afterwards, and how Germany became the engine of growth in Europe today. We have to do the same thing. If we don't develop our own financial systems, if we don't develop our own capital markets, the banking penetration in Africa today, in many parts of Africa, does not exceed 20%. It's north of 70% in Tunisia and in other countries in North Africa. So they still have a long ways to go. The insurance industry is even worse. The penetration is really low in Africa. I see that as being a great potential, and that's why we see some of the largest insurance companies now taking a very, very, very keen interest in Africa. And as you know, Africa today is on the corporate agenda of the largest corporations, organizations, development banks, and what have you. But financial system, when we talk about investments and promoting investments, should respond to a simple question: whether to judge or to assess whether the financial system is strong and is good. There's a single question that we have to ask: whether the financial system is indeed catering to the needs of all economic agents throughout the value creation chain. In other words, whether the financial system is given the right answers to the small micro enterprises and the small enterprises and the medium-sized enterprises to the largest business groups. And a good financial system should be able to cater to the needs and expectations and anticipations and problems throughout that value chain. Unfortunately, that is still not very much the case. And unfortunately, whilst in most African economies, and Tunisia is no exception, the economic fabric is by and large composed of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We don't really see any policies that are focused to address the needs of those enterprises and those economic agents. And that's when financial inclusion will come into play. Because any program, any economic program that doesn't address the point of financial inclusion, okay, and through financial inclusion, social inclusion, and some countries in Africa have been very successful in that. One country that comes to mind is Kenya. Kenya has been very successful in its financial inclusion program through mobile banking and through mobile telephony, a system called M-Pesa. In Tunisia today, for example, we still don't have, and that's shameful, we still don't have mobile banking and mobile telephony and mobile payments. And therefore, we are far from having achieved our objectives for financial inclusion in this country. And financial system, of course, I don't want to be too long, must address other problems, such as the long-term financial needs to fund infrastructure projects. As you know, in Africa, there is a dire need for infrastructure. It has been estimated that there is a deficit, a gap, a financing gap of up to $50 billion a year. And I see that as being an opportunity. And I'm happy to see that many companies from Tunisia that operate in public works are active in Africa today. And I hope that many more will go to Africa, because that's what Africa needs, infrastructure. And infrastructure, the most important segment is energy. It has been estimated, just to give you an example, it has been estimated that products that are being manufactured in Africa today lose up to 6.5% of their value because of shortages, electricity shortages, power shortages. So you see there's a really big problem there. Governance and institutions. I'm not going to be too long. I think we all agree that good governance is a key component for any successful policy or any successful program, whether it's at a country level or at enterprise level, organizational level, or even at home with our own family. Good governance would lead to good results. And in Africa, this has been a problem, and it still is very much a problem. And in governance, I include all kinds of things. I include transparency, I include accountability, I include fighting corruption, which is still very much a problem today in Africa and in our own country. So good governance will lead to at least set forth the path for a better future. And institutions. This is a very important thing because you cannot construct the future politically or economically without strong institutions. And so the question, for example, when we talk about reform and reforming the state, reforming the administration, okay? We all agree that we need to do that. And what applies to Africa applies to our own country again. But then here's the question. How are you going to go about it? Is this a sequential approach where you wait until the reform of the administration is carried out before you engage in the right policies? Do you have the time? As we know, timing is of the essence, so time is of the essence. And so how do you go about it? Well, I think the only way you can go about it is by setting forth new institutions along old institutions with specific missions. And you stuff those institutions with the best human resources that you have. It's what I call the transplant approach to change management. And those institutions, for example, you create an institution which specializes in investment, what we call in French le guichet unique, right? You can do that. And it doesn't mean that you are duplicating something that exists in the administration, but you take out some of the functions from the administration and provide the proper resources to the people who will be in charge of the institution, give them a mission, and tell them they have no time because our people cannot wait, right? And Africa will need to do that, particularly in the what is called the fragile states, where the state is failing. These are failed states. And you cannot address the problems of a failed states with failing institutions. So you have to create something new. So this is very, very important, and Africa is very much in need of that. Another problem facing Africa, which I think you are all aware of, is climate change. You all heard that, and by the way, this also applies to us, and I regret that we don't address that issue as often as we should, because it is going to have a far-reaching effect on the population of many countries, particularly countries in the Sahel region. The effects of climate change means that people will have less and less water. It has been estimated, a study that has been done by the United Nations, that 60% of the conflicts in the future will be due to water, or lack of water, because climate change and the increase in the temperature will have a very detrimental impact on the water resources in many regions in Africa. And what will happen is that people are aware of these threats and they start moving around. And so the pressure on the cities, okay, which I will talk about in 1 minute if I have time, will increase even more. Because people, just like we see it today with the migration out of Africa and out of the Middle East, people have to look elsewhere in their quest for a better life. You cannot blame them, right? But that will create problems. Look at the problems that the migratory flows are creating in Europe today. It is shaping up the political scene in Europe. So think about what will happen in our own continent with all the flows of people leaving the drought, leaving the dry areas, and moving into the cities, and moving into areas where they can drink and clean themselves, because water is essential, right? But many other aspects, which I will not mention, many other problems that the climatic change will have on shelter, on water, on energy, on health, many detrimental effects, which I'm sure you are very much aware of. Let me talk to you now about another subject, another point, which I think is extremely important, and we don't talk about it enough in our own country, which is the amazing wave of the digital economy. And what I mean by that is that the changes that the world is witnessing today, worldwide, are threatening, amazing, and we have to take them into account. I'm talking about the development, the huge development of digital economy moving forward. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. Artificial intelligence is expected to destroy 51% of the jobs that exist today within 15 years. 51%. In some countries, and you will be surprised, the one country where the effect will be the strongest is in China. China is expected to lose 77% of its jobs because of artificial intelligence. Stephen Hawking, which I'm sure you know, said that the threat to the humankind is artificial intelligence. And you may have heard of what is called the singularity principle. And the singularity principle, some scholars expect it to take place in 2035. That's tomorrow, 2035. We're not far away from 2035. And the singularity principle says the following. It says that artificial intelligence and supercomputers will take over the humanity by that time. Don't you think that we have to ask these questions and prepare our generation, our children and our grandchildren, so that they can address the threats that are awaiting them? And what applies to Africa applies to us. And we need to have this conversation because the economy is changing. Uberization, Uber, the transformation that many sectors of the economy are already witnessing. I'll give you another example to show my point. Knowledge economy. You all know WhatsApp. Did you know that WhatsApp did not exist 7 years ago? And do you know what is the value of WhatsApp today? About $27 billion. You may have heard of Snapchat. Snapchat was introduced just 2 weeks ago to the stock market in New York. Okay. While it is losing money, $500 million, $30 billion. To compare, so that you understand where the economy is going, you all know Peugeot, right? Peugeot, 1 century old, 100,000 people. Do you know what is the valuation of Peugeot today? $12 billion. So think about that. And we have to think about that. And we have to prepare our generation for حاجة حتمية. حاجة حتمية. It will happen. Ça va arriver. So, as we think about it, our African friends should also think about it. And the last point that I would like to mention is culture. We don't talk much about culture. But I believe that culture is the backbone of any development, social or economic. And by culture, I don't mean the arts. I don't mean music or writing, which of course I'm very interested in. What I mean are the values that define a society. That's culture. Culture means the values of excellency, of discipline, of hard work, of competency, of giving the best of what you can to serve your community and to serve yourself. That is culture. And you all agree. And of course, here we don't talk about culture, we talk about mentalité. Right? Same thing. We have to work on that. And there is a scholar whom I really respect. His name is Daniel Etuga Maguele. He wrote a book back in 2000. And that book is called Does Africa Need a Cultural Adjustment Program? Cultural Adjustment Program. And in that book, what he did, he compared Asia with Africa. And he tried to explain why is it that some countries with very few resources, poor, but with great people, can achieve amazing results. Let me give you an example, which I give very often. I'm sorry for those who have attended my other presentations.
logran
You all know
mejorar su
Singapore,
vida
right?
y obtener resultados mejores.
Singapore is a little
Conocen
larger than
Singapur,
Jerba,
seguramente.
600 square
Es un
kilometers.
poco más
It has
inmenso
a
que
GDP
Yerba,
half of that of all of the Maghreb countries, with 6 million square kilometers, 90 million people,
que tiene un Producto
and
Interior Bruto
$590
que supera
billion
a todos los
of
países del
GDP,
Magreb.
when it should be $3 or $4 billion. Trillion dollars. So we have some ways to go.
Entonces,
But talking about Africa, and it has been said
tenemos
by Sheikh, it has been said by the gentleman who spoke before me, we are Africans. I still watch and listen to an amazing speech made by Mbeke back in 1996. And in that speech, he starts with, "I am African." It's an amazing speech. And even when I listen to it today, I feel the chills. Why do I feel the chills? Because somehow it is in our identity. And Africa has something amazing that you don't find in other continents. We have an identity which was forged by our forefathers. And as Africans, we should ask ourselves the question, just like we ask ourselves the question as Tunisians, what is it we're doing for Tunisia? What is it we're doing for Africa? I personally and modestly have done what I believe is right. In the previous responsibilities that I had in the private sector, I mentioned to you about what I did for Morocco. I really was modestly the pioneer, or one of the pioneers of the African positioning of Morocco, and I'm trying to do the same thing now. I'm the honorary chairman and co-founder of Tunisia Africa Business Council, whose mission is to encourage business groups out of Tunisia to go invest in Africa and to explore the great opportunities that exist in Africa today. Thank you very much.